I didn't notice the end when it was happening. I wish I could say there was a moment. A clear line where everything before it was the relationship and everything after it was something else. But there wasn't. If anything, the strange part is that the relationship didn't end with noise. It ended with quiet. And I think that's why it took me so long to understand it. Because when people talk about relationships falling apart, they usually describe the obvious things. Arguments, shouting, doors closing harder than they need to, long silences that feel heavy and intentional. We didn't have much of that. Not really. And for a long time, I believed that meant we were doing something right. I thought the absence of conflict meant we were mature, stable, compatible. But now, when I think about it, I'm not sure that's what it meant at all. Sometimes I wonder if we simply didn't fight enough to notice that something between us had already started fading. But that realization came much later. Back then, everything felt normal. Not exciting in the beginning of love kind of way anymore, but normal in the way long relationships often become. Comfortable, familiar, predictable. Predictable used to feel like safety. When we first met, nothing about the relationship felt predictable. I remember the first night we really talked. Not the first time we met. The first time we talked long enough that the rest of the room disappeared. It happened at a small gathering at a friend's apartment. The kind of gathering where people pretend it's casual, but someone still cleans the kitchen twice before guests arrive. I didn't know many people there. She didn't either. We ended up sitting next to each other on the edge of a couch that was probably too small for the number of people in the room. Someone was playing music quietly. A group of people were arguing about a movie in the corner. And somehow, without planning it, we started talking. I don't remember exactly how the conversation started. Something simple. Probably a question about how we knew the host. But after that, the conversation just continued. Not forced. Not awkward. Just curious. That's the word I keep coming back to when I remember those early days. Curious. We asked each other questions the way people do when they genuinely want to know how another person thinks. Not surface questions. Not the ones people ask out of politeness. Real questions. The kind that lead somewhere unexpected. At one point, she asked me something I had never been asked before. What's something about your childhood that people usually misunderstand? I remember laughing a little when she said it. Mostly because I didn't have an answer ready. But I thought about it. And the fact that she waited for the answer mattered. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She just watched my face while I thought. Eventually, I told her a story about being the quiet kid in school. About how teachers always assumed I was shy, when really, I just liked observing people more than talking all the time. She listened in a way that felt attentive. Not performative listening. Real listening. The kind where you feel like the other person is actually inside the conversation with you. That night stretched longer than either of us expected. At some point, people started leaving. Chairs were stacked against the wall. Someone turned the music down, but we were still sitting there talking. That was the beginning. Or at least, that's the moment I think of when I try to remember where the relationship truly started. The early months felt alive in a way that's difficult to describe. Not dramatic, just open. Every conversation felt like a small discovery. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Family, work, past relationships. Other times the conversations were almost absurd. Like the night we spent an entire dinner debating whether people are more shaped by their habits or their environment. Neither of us really had expertise on the topic, but we enjoyed exploring it anyway. Conversations like that make time behave strangely. You lose track of it. Hours pass without feeling heavy. Those early months were full of that kind of time. Loose, curious, unpredictable. Even silence felt interesting then. If we sat quietly together for a moment, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause before the next question appeared. Looking back now, I realized curiosity was the engine of the relationship. We were always discovering something. A new thought, a different perspective, a story neither of us had told before. Discovery creates movement, and movement creates energy. That energy made everything feel alive. But relationships don't stay in that stage forever. At least most of them don't. Eventually, life settles around you. Routines appear. Schedules begin to overlap. What once felt spontaneous becomes organized. Dinner happens at similar times. Weekends develop patterns. You learn what the other person likes to eat, when they prefer quiet, when they prefer conversation. None of that felt bad when it started happening. In fact, it felt like progress. Like the relationship was becoming stable. We moved in together about a year after we met. Not impulsively. It felt natural by then. We were already spending most of our time in the same space anyway. Living together didn't create the kind of friction people sometimes warn you about. If anything, the transition was smooth. Almost too smooth. We divided responsibilities easily. Groceries, cooking, cleaning, bills. There was very little disagreement about those things. Friends used to joke about how calm our relationship seemed. "You two never argue," someone said once. At the time, I took that as a compliment. Now I'm not so sure. Because arguing, in a strange way, is a form of engagement. It means two people are still actively reacting to each other, still pushing, still revealing parts of themselves that aren't perfectly aligned. We didn't do much of that. If a disagreement appeared, one of us usually softened quickly, not in a resentful way, just gently, maybe too gently. One night stands out when I think about this. We were cooking dinner together. Something simple. Pasta, I think. I had a long day at work and I was quieter than usual. She noticed. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "Nothing important," I said. And that could have been the end of the conversation. But instead she waited. Just long enough. So I told her about something that had bothered me earlier that day. A conversation with a coworker that left me feeling frustrated. She listened, nodded. Then she said something calm and thoughtful. Something about how people sometimes react defensively when they feel uncertain. Her explanation made sense. And the frustration I had been carrying faded. The moment resolved smoothly, cleanly. And at the time I thought, this is how good relationships work. But later, when I replayed that memory, I noticed something else. The conversation had resolved so quickly that we never really explored the feeling behind it. It just disappeared. We moved on. And moments like that started happening more often. Small tensions that never fully developed. Questions that never led to deeper discussions. Not because we avoided each other, but because we smoothed things out before they could become complicated. At first that felt like maturity. Now I sometimes wonder if it was something else. Maybe we were protecting the calm too much. Maybe we were so careful not to disturb the peace that we slowly stopped revealing the parts of ourselves that might have created friction. And friction, strangely enough, can create discovery. Without it, everything stays smooth. But smooth surfaces can hide distance. I remember one evening in particular when the shift began to feel real. Not dramatic, just noticeable. We were sitting on the couch after dinner. A show was playing on the television. Neither of us was really watching it closely. She was scrolling through something on her phone. I had a laptop open on my lap. At some point I looked up and realized we hadn't spoken in a while. Not the comfortable silence from the early days. A different kind. A silence that felt routine, like something we had both accepted without noticing. I closed the laptop and said something about the show. A small observation. She responded, smiled slightly. Then the conversation ended again, and we went back to our separate screens. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because anything bad happened, because nothing happened. And sometimes the absence of something becomes impossible to ignore once you notice it. We had stopped interrupting each other's thoughts, stopped asking the unexpected questions that used to appear naturally. Our conversations had become efficient, practical, predictable. Predictability used to feel like stability, but over time it started to feel like something else. Like we were moving through the same emotional patterns every day. Wake up, work, dinner, television, sleep. Weekends had their own rhythm too. Groceries, maybe meeting friends, a movie, laundry, all the ordinary things people build their lives around. None of it was unpleasant, but none of it surprised me anymore either. And surprise, I'm realizing now, might be one of the quiet forces that keeps relationships alive. Without surprise, curiosity fades. Without curiosity, conversations become informational instead of exploratory. You update each other. You coordinate. But you stop discovering. The strange thing is that the relationship still looked healthy from the outside. We supported each other. We were kind. We rarely argued. But kindness alone doesn't always create closeness. Sometimes closeness requires a little disruption, a little friction, a little honesty that risks creating disagreement. We avoided that without even realizing we were doing it. And the result was a relationship that felt calm, almost too calm, like a lake without wind. Beautiful, but still. One night we went for a walk through the park near our apartment. We used to take those walks often. In the beginning, they were full of conversation, ideas bouncing back and forth, stories, questions. That night felt different. We talked for a while. About work. About a friend who had recently moved to another city. about something we might do the following weekend. Then the conversation ended, and we kept walking. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt finished, like we had already said everything the moment required. I glanced at her while we walked. She looked peaceful, thoughtful, and in that moment a strange realization appeared in my mind. Not painful, just clear. We don't challenge each other anymore. And without challenge, curiosity fades. Without curiosity, discovery stops. And without discovery, relationships slowly become something else. Not broken, just complete. And once something feels complete, people stop exploring it. They maintain it. They preserve it. But they stop expanding it. I didn't say any of this out loud. At the time, I didn't fully understand it myself. It was just a quiet thought walking beside me. But that thought stayed with me long after we returned home that night. Because for the first time, I began wondering something that had never crossed my mind before. Maybe the relationship wasn't ending because we fought too much. Maybe it was ending because we never fought enough to notice that something inside it had already gone quiet. And once something goes quiet for long enough, you start to wonder whether it's resting, or whether it has already finished speaking. I didn't say anything about that thought that night, or the next night, or the one after that. Part of me assumed it would pass, that it was just one of those strange reflections people have sometimes when they're tired or overthinking something small. Relationships settle. Everyone knows that. They become calmer, more structured, less intense, and that's supposed to be a good thing. At least that's what people say when they talk about long-term love. So I told myself the same thing. I told myself we had simply reached the stable part of the relationship, the part people work toward, the part where everything functions smoothly. No drama, no tension, just two people living side by side. But something about that explanation never felt completely convincing. Not immediately, but slowly, like a small question that keeps appearing in the back of your mind no matter how many times you try to answer it. And once a question like that appears, it tends to return, usually in quiet moments, late at night, or during the middle of an ordinary day when nothing unusual is happening. That's when I started noticing something about myself. I had begun observing the relationship instead of simply living inside it. It's a strange shift when that happens. Before, everything felt immediate. You react, you feel, you speak. But once observation enters the picture, there's a layer of distance. You watch patterns. You notice rhythms. You start asking silent questions. And the first pattern I noticed was how little friction existed between us. Not small disagreements. Those still appeared occasionally, but they dissolved quickly, almost automatically. If something slightly bothered me, I softened it before mentioning it. If something slightly bothered her, she softened it too. We were very careful with each other. At the time, that felt respectful. Now I wonder if it was something else. Maybe we were protecting the calm too much. Maybe we were afraid that if we pushed even a little, the stillness would break. And we had grown used to that stillness, comfortable inside it. There was one evening when that pattern became impossible for me to ignore. It was a Thursday. I remember that clearly for some reason. Not because Thursdays were important, because the entire evening unfolded in such a predictable way that I could almost see the pattern while it was happening. I came home a little later than usual. Work had been long. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those days where small tasks stretch longer than expected. She was already home. The kitchen light was on. I could hear music playing softly from the living room. That part felt nice. Walking into a warm apartment with quiet music always felt welcoming. She looked up when I walked in. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, setting my bag down. She nodded. "Dinner's almost ready." And that was the beginning of the evening. Everything after that unfolded almost exactly the way it usually did. We ate, talked about our days. She told me something mildly frustrating that had happened with a project at work. I told her about a meeting that had taken longer than expected. Neither story carried strong emotion, just the usual reflections people share after work. After dinner, we moved to the couch, turned on a show, watched half of it. Then both of us slowly drifted toward our phones. It wasn't rude. We were still sitting close. Sometimes one of us would make a comment about the show, but the comments didn't lead anywhere. They were small, contained. Eventually, the show ended. Neither of us started another one. She said she felt a little tired. I said the same. We brushed our teeth, turned off the lights, got into bed, and that was the evening. Nothing wrong, nothing tense, nothing broken, just complete. And lying there in the dark afterward, I had the same thought again. The one that had been following me quietly for weeks. Everything between us works. But nothing surprises me anymore. That realization didn't feel like sadness exactly. It felt more like recognition. Like noticing that a song you've been listening to for a long time has reached its final note, even though the music is still technically playing. The next morning, the routine repeated again. Coffee. Quick conversation about the day ahead. A goodbye at the door. Everything smooth. Efficient. Familiar. And familiarity had once been comforting. But now it was starting to feel settled. Not in the peaceful sense. In the finished sense. Like a room where everything has already been arranged exactly where it belongs. Nothing left to move. Nothing left to discover. Over the next few weeks, that awareness deepened. I noticed it in small ways. Like the way we anticipated each other's reactions. If she mentioned something stressful about work, I already knew the kind of reassurance she would appreciate. If I mentioned something that frustrated me, she knew exactly what to say to calm it. On the surface, that kind of understanding seems like the goal of relationships. People spend years learning each other like that. But there's a subtle difference between understanding someone and having already mapped every emotional path between you. Once every path becomes familiar, the journey loses its sense of exploration. And without exploration, emotional energy slows down. One Sunday afternoon, we were grocery shopping together. Something we had done dozens of times. Maybe more. We moved through the store almost automatically. She grabbed the vegetables she liked. I grabbed the things we usually bought for breakfast. Occasionally one of us would ask, "Do we need more of this? Did we run out of that?" The conversation stayed entirely practical. Near the end of the trip, while we were standing in line at the checkout, she looked at me and smiled. "Remember when we used to argue about what cereal to buy?" I laughed, because it was true. Early in the relationship, we had spent 10 minutes in this exact aisle debating which cereal tasted better. Back then it felt playful, like a tiny battle neither of us expected to win. Now we both just grabbed the same box every time. The argument had disappeared, just like many other small points of friction between us. And standing there in the checkout line, I suddenly realized something about that memory. Those small disagreements used to create energy. Not negative energy, just movement. Two personalities interacting. Two perspectives colliding slightly before finding balance. Now the balance existed before the collision even had a chance to happen. We had adjusted ourselves to each other so carefully that conflict almost never appeared. And without conflict, something else had quietly disappeared too. Curiosity. Curiosity needs a little unpredictability, a little uncertainty, something that makes you pause and think. I didn't expect that, but nothing between us created that feeling anymore. Not our conversations, not our routines, not even our disagreements. Everything had been smoothed out, polished, perfectly manageable. And maybe that's the moment when the deeper realization finally arrived. Not suddenly, but clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. We had become very good at preserving the relationship, but we had stopped expanding it. Preservation keeps something alive. Expansion makes it grow. Without growth, things remain stable, but they also remain still. That evening we went for another walk. The same park, the same quiet paths. We talked about something small, a movie we had watched recently. Then the conversation faded again, and we walked side by side in silence. I remember watching our shadows moving under the streetlights. Two shapes moving together, perfectly synchronized, perfectly calm. And I had another thought then. Maybe relationships don't always end with a fight. Maybe sometimes they end with agreement. Too much agreement. So much agreement that two people slowly stop challenging each other's inner world. They stop asking difficult questions. Stop exploring uncomfortable thoughts. Stop pushing past the easy answers. And once that happens, something inside the relationship becomes quiet. Not hostile. Not sad. Just quiet. We finished the walk and headed home. Neither of us said anything unusual that night. But lying in bed afterward, staring into the dark again, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. The relationship wasn't breaking. It was settling into its final shape. And that shape felt peaceful, but also strangely complete. Like a book where every page has already been read. You can still hold it, still appreciate it, but the sense of discovery is gone. And without discovery, something inside love slowly stops moving. I didn't know what to do with that realization, so I didn't do anything. I kept living inside the routine, kept sharing the apartment, kept having the same gentle conversations. But something in my mind had changed. I had started recognizing the quiet. And once you recognize it, it's difficult to stop wondering whether that quiet is temporary, or whether it's the sound of something slowly coming to an end. After a while, I stopped trying to decide whether the quiet meant something good or something bad. At first, I kept analyzing it, turning the idea around in my mind like an object I couldn't quite identify. Was this just what long relationships eventually became? Or was something slowly fading that we simply hadn't acknowledged yet? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the quiet itself wasn't the problem. Silence can exist between two people who feel deeply connected. In the beginning of our relationship, silence had often felt warm, comfortable, like a pause that held the promise of the next conversation. This silence was different, not uncomfortable, just finished. That's the word I kept coming back to. Finished. Not in the sense that the relationship had ended, but in the sense that everything inside it had already been revealed. Every story told, every opinion shared, every small habit understood. There was nothing left that felt mysterious. And mystery, I was starting to realize, is a quiet form of energy. Without it, curiosity fades. Without curiosity, conversations become predictable. And once conversations become predictable, something essential begins to slow down. I noticed this most clearly one evening when we had friends over for dinner. It wasn't a big gathering, just another couple we had known for a few years. The kind of dinner where people sit around the table longer than they expected because the conversation keeps expanding. At least, that's how those evenings usually go. And at first, it did feel like that. Stories bounced around the table. Someone mentioned a recent trip. Someone else brought up a ridiculous argument they had witnessed at work. Everyone laughed. The conversation moved easily from topic to topic. But at some point I noticed something strange. When the conversation shifted toward us, toward our relationship, I found myself struggling to think of something new to say. Our friends asked how things were going, how we had been spending our time. Normal questions. But when I answered them, my responses sounded rehearsed. Not because I had prepared them, because I had already given those same answers before. Work was going well. Things at home were calm. We had been watching a new series lately. The usual updates. Across the table, she added a few details, also familiar ones. And our friends nodded, satisfied. The conversation moved on. But something about that moment stayed with me. Because I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. If someone asked me to describe our relationship in that moment, I wouldn't know how to make it sound alive. Not unhappy, just steady. And steady is a strange word when applied to something that once felt electric. Later that night, after our friends left, we cleaned the kitchen together. She washed the dishes. I dried them. We had done this exact routine countless times. The rhythm was automatic. Plate, towel, cabinet, another plate, another cabinet. At one point she smiled slightly and said, "That was nice." Yeah, I said. It was. And it had been nice. But that word again, nice. Nice is comfortable. Nice is calm. But nice isn't the same as alive. When we finished cleaning, we turned off the kitchen light and moved into the living room. She sat on the couch and pulled a blanket over her legs. I sat beside her. The television flickered quietly in the background. At some point, she leaned her head against my shoulder. A small, familiar gesture. One that once would have filled me with warmth. Now it felt expected. And that realization startled me a little. Not because the gesture was empty, because I could predict it. Just like I could predict almost everything else between us. The rhythm of our evenings. The tone of our conversations. The pauses. The reassurances. Everything followed patterns we both knew too well. I remember looking down at her resting against my shoulder and thinking something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud before. We know each other completely. And for a moment, I tried to interpret that thought as something beautiful. Complete understanding. Total familiarity. Those sound like the goals people talk about when they describe long-term love. But something inside me resisted that interpretation. Because complete knowledge can also mean the end of discovery. And discovery had once been the heartbeat of the relationship. Without it, the relationship felt preserved rather than alive. That night, lying in bed again, I stared into the dark and followed the thought a little further than I had before. Maybe the reason we never fought wasn't because we were perfectly compatible. Maybe it was because we had slowly stopped challenging each other. Stopped revealing the parts of ourselves that might disrupt the calm. Stopped asking questions that might open something unexpected. We protected the peace. And in doing so, we may have also protected the relationship from growth. Growth often requires friction, not destructive friction, just enough tension to create movement. We had removed almost all tension from our lives together, and what remained was harmony, perfect harmony, the kind where every note blends smoothly with the others. But harmony without variation eventually becomes background noise. The next few weeks continued exactly the way the previous ones had. Work, dinner, television, sleep. Weekends filled with errands and occasional plans. From the outside, everything looked stable. People would probably describe our relationship as healthy. But inside the quiet of those evenings, I began noticing something else. A subtle emotional distance. Not distance created by conflict. Distance created by familiarity. We no longer needed to ask each other who we were. We already knew. And knowing removed the curiosity that once connected us. There was one night when the realization finally settled completely into place. It happened during another walk. Same park, same path. The air was colder that evening. Winter had started to settle into the city. Our breath appeared in small clouds as we walked. We talked a little. About work. About something we needed to buy for the apartment. Then the conversation ended. And the silence stretched longer than usual. Not uncomfortable. Just complete. And somewhere in that silence, a thought appeared that felt both simple and impossible to ignore. We didn't fight enough to notice the end. If there had been arguments, raised voices, moments where frustration forced us to confront what we were feeling, maybe we would have discovered something still alive beneath the surface. But we never allowed things to reach that point. We softened every tension, resolved every disagreement before it had the chance to grow, protected the calm, and slowly, without realizing it, we also protected ourselves from discovering whether anything deeper remained. By the time I recognized that pattern fully, the relationship had already settled into something quiet, something stable, something finished, not broken, not painful, just complete. And sometimes I wonder if that's the most confusing way for love to end. Not with anger, not with heartbreak, just with the slow realization that two people have reached the end of the conversation without ever raising their voices.